to do what we should have done a long time ago, and that is support housing in a real and significant way. In this bill, as you mentioned, I have down payment assistance for first-generation home buyers. I have money to rehabilitate and renovate our public housing that's in great disrepair. We have people who have been waiting for years for Section 8 vouchers. I have money in this bill for Section 8 vouchers. I have money for the cities with the CDBG programs, with the home programs. And to tell you the truth, if there is going to be a real effort to deal with the discrimination and the exclusion of people of color and people who are working every day but can't afford to have rent, then we've got to spend the money in order to deal with the housing crisis in America. And this includes homelessness. I don't see how we can absolutely have a Reconciliation Act, nor can we have an Infrastructure Act without considering that housing is infrastructure, and it is central to our economy. So I'm fighting very hard to hold on to and to save the work that we have done in my committee in order to support real housing in this country.
And, you know, I have to say a lot of civil rights groups are in your corner. I mean, they've talked about housing as a way for equality, particularly for communities of color.
In a real and significant way.
Been a victim of institutional racism or systemic white supremacy don't seem to understand this concept. Take a listen to your senator or your colleague in the Senate, Joe Manchin, to hear his views on entitlement.
I'm just not, so you know. I cannot accept our economy or basically our society moving towards an entitlement mentality, that you're entitled, okay? I'm more of a rewarding, because I can help those who really need help if those who can help themselves do so.
Congresswoman, I think what the American people cannot accept is one senator who represents a tiny speck of America going against the will of the people. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm with you, and I think the same way. It is absolutely not to be understood that these two members of the Senate can talk about this being too much. Too much for whom? For people who have been denied, discriminated against, and excluded in every sector of our society. And simply to say that this is too much money and reject particularly housing and child care and climate change and all of this is baffling to me. I don't get it. And even with Sinema, she has not indicated exactly what it is in this bill that's so objectionable to her that she would like to have taken out. And as for Manchin, maybe he doesn't understand people who work every day who are paying 50% of their income on housing, people who work every day and can't afford a down payment, even though they could afford the mortgage, but that down payment is too much. People who don't have the security deposit to get a rental unit because it would double the cost of getting into that rental unit in a real and significant way. And they live very well. And they maybe don't have empathy or any real concerns for those who are less fortunate. And so whether we're talking about poor people or middle-class people who work every day but can't afford the housing that is safe and secure for their families, I don't know. Maybe they just don't get it. Maybe they just don't want to get it. Yeah.
Well, I don't know too many people who can afford a house and to live on a yacht and be so confounded by housing insecurity. So good point there. But the problem with Manchin is, look, if we lose Manchin in Congress, it's not like the Democrats are guaranteed that another Democrat will take his seat. So the solution really is, you know, don't depend on these two senators. However, with the attack on voting rights, with gerrymandering, and all the other ways we're suppressing the people's voice being heard in this country, can Democrats elect more Democratic members to the upper chamber and maintain control of the House? Because really that would solve a lot of challenges, particularly when it comes to the filibuster.
Well, that's why voter registration and voting rights are so important. And when we're fighting against voter suppression, we're basically fighting against the fact that there are people who should be involved in decisions of this democracy, who are not being involved, who could elect, we could elect to have a more progressive Congress of the United States. And so we've got to work hard to try and elect more members who are Democratic, more members who are progressive. We should have done a long time ago. In many of these districts, we have the numbers in a real but we don't have the involvement and the participation. So we're fighting against voter suppression. We're doing everything that we can to help people to understand that if we are to have a decent quality of life for all Americans, they have got to be involved. It is a struggle. And I know that Manchin knows that he's in a great position because he comes from a district that, a state rather, that you may not be able to elect a Democrat in. And he's using it, and I don't know to whose advantage, because it doesn't make good sense for him to hold out and to stand in the way of moving forward in this country, building back better, as the president has organized and is committed to. And I want to tell you what we're doing and what the president is doing is a demonstration of our real values.
Right,
we
exactly.
value the families. We value the children. We value education. We value people not having to live on the street and have a decent place to live. And this is how you show your values, is by supporting what they need in order to have a good quality of life.
Congresswoman, you spoke beautiful words, very true this morning, and thank you so much. Perhaps one solution is to have more black women in the Senate. So we'll keep our eye on that. Thank you so much for joining me, Congresswoman. I look forward to seeing you again very soon. And coming up for all you guys at home, across the country, maps are being redrawn that will determine the outcome of future elections. And it's
a GOP congressional delegation who promised that they would engage with us as they have done in the past. To see this district that had been together for 50 years demolished by this state Senate insensitive in putting my dear friend Congressman Al Green and myself in the same district. It is extremely short-sighted. It is unconstitutional. It violates the Voting Rights Act. And frankly, I'm making an inquiry as to why.
All right, that was Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who has some words for the Republicans drawing her congressional district. The Texas Senate on Friday approved a new congressional map that increases the number of white majority districts while reducing the voting power for Texans of color. Nearly every state in the country is redrawing their congressional districts after the 2020 census, and 4 have already enacted their new maps. Now, these redistricting efforts are critical, especially for black and brown communities, because when has gerrymandering ever worked in our favor? Joining me to discuss is Michael Lee, senior counsel for the Brennan Center's Democracy Program, and Doug Spencer, election law scholar and professor at the University of Colorado. Michael, I want to kick it off with you because I've been reading your research at the Brennan Center, and it's quite fascinating and something that, quite frankly, we've been dealing with for a long time. Now, explain, because a lot of people, this has not been a big issue that's easily digestible for a lot of people across the country. We're narrowly focused on voting rights in the state houses and at the federal level, but gerrymandering can have a direct impact on who has a voice when it comes to these federal elections.
To vote, what gerrymandering does is essentially renders your vote meaningless because the results of the election will be predetermined by the way that the districts are drawn, either because they are drawn to discriminate against people of color or to guarantee a political effect, or both. And that's something that can be in place for the whole of the decade, right? It's not just about the 2022 election. You hear a lot of people talking about the 2022 election, but really this is about who will hold power and what democracy will look like for the whole of the decade to come.
And I think you make a really good point, and just I want to make it really clear to our viewers what happened in Texas. So we talked a bit about this in the intro, but the map that they've drawn in Texas, Doug, it distinguishes, as people of color, they were responsible for 92 or 95% of the state's population over the last decade, with Latinos making up nearly 2 million. That's almost half of the state's 4 million additional residents. So when we look at it in that context, it really does dilute the voting power. So, when I look at how to get out of this, is it possible for Democrats to acknowledge that, yes, gerrymandering is wrong, but for Democrats to actually gerrymander in areas where they can, just to fight the practice?
Well, this is something that Democrats are in a debate about right now among themselves, particularly if you look in the state of New York. New York has an independent commission. Democrats in the state ceded authority, or at least under Governor Cuomo, had kind of ceded authority of redistricting to an independent commission, not completely independent because some of the members are appointed by legislators in that state. And the commission's drawing maps and is split about this, but there's some debate about whether the Democrats in the state legislature should use their supermajority to override the maps that are drawn by this commission in order to maximize the number of seats that Democrats can get in the state, precisely for this reason that you bring up, to counteract what Democrats fear may be happening in Georgia or Texas or other states where Republicans control the process, and which, at least on early drafts of maps in Texas, suggest that the voting rights of people of color will be muted.
Which is so incredibly problematic as we face all of these attacks on voting rights. Michael, something that I found really interesting is that census policy says that the incarcerated are counted in the states where they are incarcerated. But this makes no sense because it's not like that the incarcerated can hold their elected representatives accountable, for one. And two, upon their release, they go back to their home states.
And that is support housing in a real and significant way.
What can we do to stop that?
Well, what you're talking about, Tiffany, is prison gerrymandering, what is commonly called prison gerrymandering. And that's the practice of counting incarcerated people at the sites of the prison rather than in their home communities, even though they may only spend a short time in prison and be back in their home communities before you know it. And the reality is, in most of the country, prisons are located oftentimes in very rural areas. In New York, where I am right now, most of the prisons are located upstate. Most of the people in prison come from the downstate, the New York City area, and that's the same in Texas and other states. And so the effect of that is to give more power to rural, oftentimes whiter areas, and to have less political power for urban areas where most of the prisoners come from. And it's completely distortive. It's something that the Census Bureau itself has thought about changing. It didn't do so last decade. It may do so in the future, but some states are changing, like California and New York will voluntarily reallocate incarcerated people back to their home communities to make sure that they're counted where they ultimately have the ties and where they ultimately go back to. And to eliminate this really distortive practice that dilutes the power, particularly of Black and Latino communities, because of the mass incarceration problem that we have in the United States.
So, and some would argue that practice was the punishing criminal justice system was created to dilute the power of Black and brown voices. So, Doug, the common theme here between all of these, erosions on our democracy is how can we keep these Black and brown folks out of exercising their civic engagements? It's exhausting, and it's been happening for, hundreds of years. How can we make the issue of gerrymandering more digestible and a bigger issue
we should have done a long time ago,
to take this message to voters when it's time to ask folks to show up to vote in their local state representatives and school board elections and all these other places, because that's where these decisions are getting made, right, at these state houses. And it's just exhausting to have to keep convincing people to fight to save these legislative failures.
There's so much attention paid on congressional districts. It's unbelievable, because most of the actions happening in the state legislatures, town council, school boards, issues that affect our lives directly, far more elections happening, but the same pattern, as you noted, keeps creeping up over and over. Whether it's prison gerrymandering, you led off with this story about Texas. The Texas population is about 40% white and about 40% Latino in that state. And people of color represented about 90% of the growth between 2010 and 2020. So to not increase the number of effective opportunity districts for people of color in the state of Texas itself would already be remarkable. But to then remove some of these districts, which it looks like is happening in these maps, is just, it's unbelievable. I don't think that it would survive a Voting Rights Act lawsuit. But I will say the harm sometimes is not just that people of color are unable to make it to the ballot box, or when they do come to the ballot box, their vote is diluted in some way. The harm sometimes is expressive. It's a statement from the state government that we don't care about your voices, and we want to make sure that you know that. And so I see that as part of the point sometimes. And I think that's what's going on in Texas. They know that this map that they put forward wouldn't survive a Voting Rights Act challenge, but it's serving the purpose of expressing the will of the state that some people belong in the political community and some don't. And as you noticed, this is not the first time this has happened. This is a long-standing problem in United States politics.
It's the temerity for me, Doug, you know, the people who built this country to blatantly say, we don't care about your participation in this process. It's exhausting and enraging at the same time. Thank you so much, Michael Lee and Doug Spencer, for joining us for a very complicated conversation on gerrymandering.
In a real
you guys
and
have
significant
to come back.
way.
Up next, some of America's biggest companies have pledged billions of dollars to racial justice causes, but there may be limits to just how far corporate funding and programs can really affect change. We're going to explore